Hello everyone and welcome. My name is Sam Goff. I'm the editorial director here at Klassiki. We're really proud to have a wide-ranging collection of Ukrainian film on our site, spanning from the silent era through to the 21st century. It's a really rich film heritage, which of course today is under attack in several senses, both in the Russian government's assault on the very notion of Ukrainian cultural identity and in its physical attack on the infrastructure that guards and protects that heritage, such as archives and museums. A film was often used by Ukrainian artists in the Soviet era as a way of expressing and exploring the question of national identity. And perhaps the most significant movement to emerge in the country during the communist period was the unofficial tendency that would later come to be known as Ukrainian Poetic cinema. This was a movement that drew on the country's long tradition of so-called folk modernism to produce visions of Ukrainian life that were sometimes surreal, sometimes almost ethnographic, which at the time were both censored and celebrated, but which are now recognized as milestones in Ukrainian film history. So like I say, Ukrainian Poetic cinema harked back to the late 19th century tradition of folk modernism, where artists such as the writer Sholem Aleichem or the painter Marc Chagall blended traditional themes with formal innovation. Several decades later, the great Ukrainian Soviet director Alexander Divzhenko would once again blend the avant-garde with the folkloric, most notably in his later silent films such as Venehora or his 1930 masterpiece Earth. Divzhenko's visions of his native countryside in their poetic, expressionistic qualities and his understanding of man's relationship to nature would prove highly influential when, in the mid-60s, Ukrainian directors began to insist upon a distinct Ukrainian cultural identity and to reject what the scholar Joshua First has called the exoticization and domestication of Ukrainian identity that had been popularized in more mainstream Soviet film. Now, interestingly, the director who's often seen as responsible for kickstarting poetic cinema proper was not in fact a native Ukrainian, but was the Georgian-born Armenian auteur Sergei Parajanov. Parajanov had moved to Ukraine from Moscow in the 1950s, and his love for his new adopted homeland was given full voice in the 1965 masterpiece Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors. This is Parajanov's Ukrainian take on Romeo and Juliet, concerning the doomed romance between the villagers Ivanko and Marichka, who are members of the Hutsul ethnic and linguistic minority in the Carpathian Mountains. Parajanov's film established many of the conventions that would go on to define Ukrainian poetic cinema. It rejected state-sponsored socialist realism in favour of an exuberant and expressionistic visual style and soundscape. It engaged with that folk modernist tradition, particularly the literature. The film is an adaptation of an eponymous novel by the great Mikhailo Kozyubinsky. And it drew inspiration from the folk life and tradition of Ukraine's south and western highlands, where a more authentic, more organic way of life was seen to have persisted. The film also starred the great Ivan Mykolaichuk, who would go on to become one of poetic cinema's most versatile stars, and the cinematographer was Yuri Ilyenko, who would also go on to be one of the movement's most prominent directors. Parajanov's model was taken up and adapted by Ukrainian filmmakers in the next decade or so, often meeting with disapproval or outright censorship from the Soviet authorities, who saw in poetic cinema an undesirable Ukrainian nationalism and formal experimentation. On Klassiki, you can watch a number of the most iconic films that resulted. For instance, there's Leonid Osika's canonical 1968 film, The Stone Cross, which is also an adaptation of an earlier novel, in this case the work of Vasil Stefanik, and which concerns an elderly peasant at the end of the 19th century making the heavy decision to emigrate from Ukraine to Canada in search of a better life. There's also Boris Ivchenko's Anichka. This is a wartime melodrama, a curious subsection of poetic cinema, where the director's interests in national identity, Ukrainian national identity, are juxtaposed, sometimes delicately, sometimes provocatively, with the demands of official Soviet historiography. And then there's Yuri Ilyenko's The White Bird Marked with Black, again nominally a war film, but one that really pushes the visual and historical scope of poetic cinema to the max, with its depiction of the lives and times of a family of musicians living on the Ukrainian-Romanian border during the turbulent 1940s. All of these films deploy the roving camera work, the folk music and costuming, and the allegorical complexity that continue to make poetic cinema such an inspirational body of work to this day. And we really hope that you enjoy watching these films and the rest of our Ukrainian collection here on Klassiki.